deaths to see if there could be something or someone casting a shadow over Ward 4. The case found its way to Chief Superintendent Stuart Clifton.
One of my detective sergeants at Grantham contacted me to say that he'd had a call from Grantham Hospital which suggested that they'd had a high number of collapses of children which may or may not be down to some criminal act. When I use the term collapsed, I'm talking in terms of each of them having stopped breathing, and the resuscitation team, known colloquially as the crash team, were called to resuscitate the children. There were two paediatricians employed at the hospital, Dr. Porter and Dr. Nanyakara, who had differing opinions about whether...
Hi, I'm Giovanni Hallart, and today we're just going to be drawing some more. I'm slowly working on this. Yeah, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, Tumblr, Twitch, and YouTube, and Patreon for more. Links are in the bios. It's going to be a chill night session, just drawing until I have to go. Alright, let's go. Let's have fun with this.
Whether the collapses of children at that hospital over a period of about 3 months were actually medically related, or whether they were at the hands of somebody who was causing those collapses.
After a meeting between detectives and doctors on the 3rd of May, it was decided they'd ask Professor David Hull, an expert in paediatrics, to give his insight on each of the cases.
He set out in some detail his findings, but concluded by saying, of the 13 children that I've looked at, I think that there are only 3 that are worthy of further investigation.
I am back.
In 2 of these cases, I feel that there will be a medical explanation.
And
in one case, a little boy called Paul Crampton, I think it's worthy of further investigation.
5-month-old Paul Crampton had been admitted to Ward 4 on the 20th of March 1991 with a chest infection. His dad David remembers it well.
Paul was actually born with measles, and he was taken home, and then after a relatively short period, a few months, Kath took him to the doctors, my wife, and he had a wheeze. They were, I think, overcautious, but that's the right thing with a child of that age, and they took him into hospital.
The first 3 days of his care were completely unremarkable, and he was expected to go home on that 3rd day.
Right, perfect.
During the course of that day, Beverly Allett brought to the attention of other nurses the fact that this little boy was having difficulty breathing.
I walked into a scene I did not expect, and that was Paul in the arms of a nurse, I think, at that particular time. He was cold, clammy, grey. And I recall that Nurse Beverly Allett was there, and she said at the time, this child is hypoglycemic. The doctor had been called. The doctor came and Paul was taken into the treatment room, and he disappeared for what seemed to be an eternity before we were allowed into the treatment room. And I remember Paul sat there playing with his toes. He seemed to have made a total recovery.
The following day, which was a Sunday, Beverly Allett went to take the drip down, and within the space of a few minutes, the boy was once again hypoglycemic.
So obviously that was quite frightening. So we went within a very short space of time from a child that's coming home to a child that's now seriously ill, and without too much explanation.
3 days later, this little boy is expected to go home that day because he's continued to recover from his attacks. At about 10 minutes to 12, the boy's father goes up to the hospital canteen to get himself a sandwich, and when he returns some 20 minutes or so later, he finds a little boy that is grey, arched back, and clearly in some form of...
Did you know that Amazon has a $15 million fund that they have to pay out every month? And here's how you can get
distress.
Call came from the ward that Paul had collapsed again, and my colleague rushed through, and when he saw his collapse, he immediately called the team from Nottingham and transferred him.
Thanks for the likes, appreciate that a lot.
The ambulance, both with my wife and with a doctor.
I just realised the hair's flipped the other way.
The ambulance with him. I remember walking into the ward at Queen's Medical Centre, and it was just totally different atmosphere. Calm, relaxed. Paul was in intensive care, but I just got the feeling that he was just going to get better. And he did.
with 7-week-old Liam Taylor, who was admitted on the 21st of February 1991, just 2 days after nurse Beverly Allett had begun working on Ward 4. They had to tread carefully.
In a healthcare setting, it is very difficult to investigate a murder or a suspected murder because all of the individuals on that ward have a legitimate reason to be there. They have the access to the victim anyway. And often it's very difficult to prove that direct link between one particular member of staff and one particular victim. So the police have got a really, really difficult job on their hands when they're investigating this type of crime.
And it wasn't going to get any easier.
About a week or so into the inquiry, the whole investigation was blown by the local paper. And of course, then the world's press descended on Grantham.
Local radio reporter Sean Dunderdale was one of the first journalists to latch on to the story.
None of us had experienced a story like this before. We kind of heard rumours. We knew the police were involved at the hospital, that something was happening, but exactly what? I mean, at that stage, I don't think even the police knew what they were facing, what they were coping with. Because nobody knew what was happening, there wasn't that much information to start with, and slowly it started to develop as a story that clearly something big was happening at Grantham, that there was a major investigation, and eventually it did sort of get out there into the media that there had been certainly a number of odd occurrences involving children on the children's ward.
Detectives began to approach family members of the victims with the shocking news that their children may have been deliberately attacked by an active serial killer.
In the early stages of the investigation, the parents certainly had an attitude that suggested that the police should not be interfering with an investigation of this type. I think it's fair to say that as the teams began to investigate the circumstances and they became more and more aware of the circumstances surrounding the collapse of their child, they became more and more on board.
Police had to try and find a link between all 13 of the children who'd been affected. They began with the first suspicious case, the death of 7-week-old Liam Taylor, who'd been left under the care of a new staff nurse, Beverly Allett.
On the 21st of February of 1991, he was taken to Grantham Hospital and was seen by one of the paediatricians and diagnosed with bronchiolitis. A couple of hours later, they see their child with just a nappy on. He's clearly terribly distressed, and the nurse, Beverly Allett, explains that during the course of feeding, he'd vomited and choked. The next evening, the two parents decide to stay in the hospital. The mom's so tired that she goes to bed early.
Thank you, Dee. Appreciate
that. The father
that.
stays up. He looks in on the child just before midnight after having had a shower at the hospital and sees that there's a nurse with him. He goes off to bed thinking that the problems are over. And he's awoken.
I can't read that. Your font's different.
By the night
Does UCA?
who asks him to come because Liam has relapsed. The child's blue, back's arched.
Thank you for the follow. Appreciate that.
Tells them that he stopped breathing and they'd had some difficulty restarting the heart later that morning.
I'm just doing some touches up here on the line work.
Sadly, I had to share with the parents and say, look, this is impossible, but I can't do anything more. I felt so sad. He died in my hands.
That is terrible.
The last nurse to tend to Liam before his death was Beverly Allett, who joined the ward just 4 days previously. It was her first ever nursing role.
So Beverly Allett had applied to other hospitals, other departments for a job as a nurse upon her completing her qualification, and she'd been turned down by all of them. When Ward 4 employed Beverly Allett, it was because they were incredibly short-staffed. They were pretty desperate. They needed more nurses on duty. And normally, they wouldn't have taken Beverly Allett on because she didn't have the correct level of qualifications, the usual level of qualifications that they would ask for. So it was desperation, really.
Allet had begun training as a nurse at 16. Even at a young age, she seemed to have an unhealthy fascination with hospitals.
She was a regular in the A&E department. She would constantly turn up there complaining of various symptoms and illnesses, and she got a bit of a reputation amongst the staff there, so they were very surprised to learn that she was a trainee nurse, and the dots just simply weren't joined up, because often when somebody is a nurse and they're training as a nurse, you're only seeing them, you know, during that part of their day. You're not seeing the bigger picture.
Detectives investigating the suspicious incidents on Ward 4 had begun to look into each case to find a common link. Beverly Allet had again been on duty on the 5th of March 1991, the day that Timothy Hardwick was admitted.
Someone said it,
Timothy Hardwick was
he said there's no such thing as
11-year-old
coincidence.
boy who had a lot of problems in his life. He suffered with cerebral palsy and was epileptic. He had an epileptic fit at school in Newark. As a result, he was transferred to Grantham Hospital, where doctors managed to get his fitting under control. A very, very short time after Beverly had been left with him, this child suddenly stops breathing. She raises the alarm, and the crash team are called.
One of the staff nurses came to my office and said, "Dr. Nanayakar, can you please come and see Timothy? He is not well." Apparently, he had collapsed, and then when I went there, I tried to resuscitate him, but by that time he virtually had no signs of life.
Sadly, they can't resuscitate him, and the child dies.
Just 5 days later, on March the 10th, 14-month-old Kaylee Desmond was on Ward 4 suffering with a chest infection, after being left a low insulin count in the blood of Paul Crampton, who survived. They continued their investigations with the cases of 2 more suspiciously ill children, Bradley Gibson and 2-year-old Yik Chan.
Bradley Gibson is admitted under Dr. Porter. He was about 5 or 6 year old and had breathing difficulties. Dr. Porter had treated him with possible chest infection. And he then suddenly had stopped breathing and stopped his heartbeat as well, what we call a cardiac arrest, which is extremely rare.
He has a big
Dr. Porter had tried repeatedly to resuscitate him with the defibrillator. He managed to get him round, extremely fortunate.
Yik Chan was admitted with a suspected fractured skull. He's in the hospital for a couple of days and he's charging around the place. There's clearly not very much wrong with him. One particular evening, Beverly Allet is going off duty and she speaks to the oncoming nurse at about 9 o'clock in the evening and said, "Can you have a look in at Chan? He's crying, he's not very well." The oncoming nurse goes into the room and finds him with his back arched and blue, and the crash team are called and he's resuscitated.
Bradley Gibson and Yik Chan both survived unscathed. 3-month-old identical twins, Katie and Becky Phillips, were not so lucky. The pair were born prematurely and were regular visitors to Ward 4. In early April 1991, they
You could go your whole life thinking you have dry damaged hair when it's actually wavy.
I started using custom hair care from Pros because I
were back and being treated by Dr. Nana Yakada.
They had repeated admissions, not surprisingly again, with variety of illnesses, diarrhea, vomiting, breathing difficulties, and so on and so forth. And the parents, quite rightly, were very worried and brought them straight to the hospital rather than going to the GP. I had seen them and discharged them, reassured the parents, but the same night, Becky was brought to the casualty. The casualty staff taking lots of effort to resuscitate her, but she was virtually dead. So I had a long discussion with the parents. They were completely shocked and they were very, very upset. I left some blood samples in the laboratory for any future investigations if needed.
We subsequently found that blood and had it analysed, and that contained 9,660 milliunits per litre of insulin in the blood. And you always have to remember with these huge figures that a child should have 15 to 20 milli-units. So it's horrendous.
Later on that same day, April the 5th, Dr. Nana Yakara asked Becky's parents to bring her twin sister Katie in as a precaution.
Katie's taken into hospital, and that afternoon she is allocated to the care of Beverly Allett. One of the senior nurses goes to that particular room to see what's going on. As she enters, she sees Beverly Allett nursing the child in her arms. The child's crying. She sees that the child collapse within Beverly Allett's arms, and the crash team are called. They manage to resuscitate Katie, who is later transferred. But over the next 3 days, the child Katie suffers convulsions, and this child is severely brain damaged as a result of what occurred. Now, during my investigation,
appreciate the likes, thank you.
Jones managed to find x-rays that were taken at the time. The child had squeeze injuries which had broken a number of ribs.
This was further evidence that proved to detectives that something very sinister was happening on Ward 4 at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital. Between the deaths of Becky Phillips on the 5th of April and Claire Peck on April the 22nd, 4 more boys had been admitted with minor symptoms and unexpectedly came close to death. That made a total of 13 suspicious incidents, 4 deaths and 9 close calls. But now investigators had the arduous task of making a list of suspects. One of the names on that list was a woman who always seemed to be on duty whenever something went wrong. 22-year-old staff nurse, Beverly Allett. In May 1991, police were investigating a spate of mysterious deaths and illnesses on the children's ward at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in Lincolnshire. After digging deeper into the individual cases, they were certain they were chasing a serial killer.
There's clear evidence of air injected under the arm of one child. There's evidence of squeeze injuries. There's evidence of insulin. What was a common factor with the vast majority of these children was that each of them had a cannula fitted, a site, usually in the back of the hand, where drugs or drips can be administered through. So injecting cardiotoxic drugs would not be very difficult because it could go in through the IV port.
This is quite a common method for, firstly, a female serial killer and a healthcare serial killer. Poison is a very common method used by these people. It's accessible. It's something that is not going to immediately cause concern because this is something that's already in that hospital environment anyway. And also, poisoning is quite a remote method of killing somebody. You're not up close and personal with them. It's not messy. You can administer the poison and then leave the scene. You don't have to see them suffer the effects of it.
Chief Superintendent Stuart Clifton and his team interviewed all the staff members on Ward 4, and a new piece of evidence emerged that suddenly became crucial.
I began to look at the circumstances of insulin in Grantham Hospital, and I found that it was kept in locked fridges on the wards, and on the children's ward, the key to the fridge had gone missing 3 days before the first child had collapsed. Beverly Allett was the last known person to have that key, but no hospital investigation had actually taken place.
Beverly Allett's name kept cropping up. She always seemed to be at the hospital when the incidents occurred, and the staff duty rota confirmed this.
What we discovered was that for every collapse, Beverly Allett was the only nurse that was on duty on every occasion.
That's
and
very
on many
suspicious.
of these occasions, we could actually put her right at the bedside, either at the time of the collapse or just before.
On the 21st of May 1991, Stuart Clifton made the brave decision of having Beverly Allett arrested.
I basically couldn't take the chance that if she was still working on there, she would harm more children, albeit that I hadn't completed the investigation by any means. We were merely scraping the surface at that time. So she was arrested and the house was searched. During the course of that search, we found a hospital pillowcase, a used syringe, and a little child's notebook, and it was headed allocations book.
This allocations book had gone missing from Ward 4. It detailed the names of children who needed extra attention and which nurse was allocated to them. It was not only further proof that Allitt had been caring for the children who died, but evidence that she was hiding the information from her colleagues.
Beverly Allitt was interviewed at the police station over the course of 2 days. She made no admissions. In fact, she went so far as to distance herself from all the events at that hospital, saying things such as, "I wasn't there on that day, I didn't come on duty until after that had happened." So she completely distanced herself, maintained her innocence. She was a very strange girl in the interview, in that she would talk to you quite normally, or talk to the interviewing officers quite normally about things like football, pop music. And the minute you got down to actually talking about the events at Grantham Hospital, she became a completely different person.
When news of the arrest broke, the press knew this was a huge story.
Once the investigation went that one step further, and obviously a nurse had been arrested, a nurse was clearly under investigation, they had to go public with that, and that's when it all exploded, really. That's when the world's media were suddenly interested, because
it's about listening to people. I give my phone number out to everyone. They tell me things are expensive out there. That's why
Easy.
before that a nurse would do such a thing. You know, it's such a rarity, and certainly in this country a first. The whole of Grantham was just surrounded by journalists, TV crews from around the world, newspapers.
Allitt's arrest was also a huge shock for the victims' families.
Yeah.
I felt
guys.
mixed emotions. One is he would want to harm a child, but secondly, we now know what was wrong with Paul, and thank God it's not anything to do with Paul. It's not a medical problem. It is an outside influence.
Stuart Clifton and his team were convinced that Allitt was behind the deaths, but they had no proof. She was released on bail without charge.
I convinced the hospital that they needed to suspend Beverly Allitt from duty because we couldn't take the chance, and they couldn't take the chance, that another child would be attacked.
The police needed to build a case. If they were right about Allitt, then they just released a serial killer into the public. Chief Superintendent Stuart Clifton turned back to the expert who just a month previously had concluded the majority of the cases could be explained medically.
I asked David Hull to go away and re-look at the case notes of the children, but to use the statements that my team had taken, which detailed the circumstances of the collapse of each of these children. He agreed to do that.
Months passed as Stuart Clifton and his team built the case against Beverly Allitt. And by November 1991, Professor Hull had re-examined his original case notes. Based on the new evidence found by detectives, he agreed that all the incidents could be viewed as suspicious. On the 20th of November, Allitt was arrested once more.
The former nurse is charged with the murder of 4 children. She also faces 8 charges of attempted murder of 8 other children. She faces a further 8 charges of causing grievous bodily harm with intent.
She was due to appear at the Grantham Magistrates Court the next day. Bear in mind, this is a young girl that's never been in police custody before. And at 9 o'clock the next morning, one of the police women had to go and wake her up. She didn't appear to have a care in the world.
There wasn't very much in the way of remorse. She didn't cry. There was no kind of real visible reaction in her. So I think she does have that kind of cold personality. She's orchestrated all of these terrible events, but she doesn't feel any impact from them. She's somebody who doesn't have the same feelings and emotions as the rest of us.
During the 15-month wait for her trial, the stunned press began to uncover Beverly Allitt's history of faking illnesses and self-harming.
The more we dug into Allitt's background, again, the more unbelievable it became. And the one question our listeners would ask is, how? How did nobody spot all of this and allow her to continue being a nurse? How did she get through that recruitment process?
We got authorization from her to have a look at her medical records. They indicated, going back to childhood, that Beverly liked to be the center of attention. There were incidents while she was at school where she would sprain a finger and demand that her arm be put in a sling.
I think it's tempting to look back and say they should have picked up on that. They should have known that this was somebody who was not quite right. But I don't think they would have automatically made the link between somebody who was perhaps harming themselves and somebody who would then go on to harm other people. Nurses care for their patients. They want to preserve their lives and enhance their quality of life. So to think that a nurse would do this it's almost unthinkable.
On February the 15th, 1993, 24-year-old Beverly Allitt was in Nottingham Crown Court, charged with the murder of 4 children and the attempted murder of a further 9. Her not guilty plea meant a trial would have to take place.
For much of the time, Beverly was not there because she was suffering from anorexia and was supposedly too ill to attend trial. The judge in his wisdom ruled that it should go ahead without her.
The court case was a very harrowing experience. I mean, it was a long drawn-out affair. Beverly Allitt wasn't in court for a lot of it. Again, I think some of that manipulation that she was known for, some of the manipulation she'd clearly done in the hospital, she was trying it with the court case as well, and I know that was having an impact on family members. They knew of their own individual case, but the actual scale of it, apart from what they'd read in the media, heard on the radio, it was the first time they'd actually heard exactly what had been happening at Grantham Hospital.
I mean, that was quite traumatic because obviously there was significant media interest and we couldn't walk down the street from the car park to the court case without having microphones and stuffed under our nose and cameras flashing. And, you know, there's a lot of emotion around that time, clearly.
You couldn't just go home and, you know, close the door and put the TV on and forget about it. It just was all-encompassing. It was the only thing that was on my mind throughout the case and for a long time afterwards as well.
In the times that Allitt was in the courtroom, she seemed completely distanced from what was going on around her.
I firmly believe she felt the families would still be on her side because, you know, they'd been very close. You know, they thought, certainly initially, in those initial stages, that, you know, she'd helped save or tried to save their child's life. And so in court, you know, she would smile at them.
To the outside world, a lot of the evidence may have seemed circumstantial, but as the trial went on, it became clear the case against Allitt was a strong one.
For a long time, people believed it must be a mistake. You know, a nurse surely wouldn't be responsible for that. There must be some other explanation for it. But then slowly, as the evidence was revealed, you could see that tide turning, that people suddenly realised, complete revulsion, that a nurse, of all people, would do that. You know, it's suddenly like, well, if I can't trust a nurse, who can I trust? And I think that was a real shock to the nation. It resonated right across the country when those actual facts came out about what Beverly Allitt had done.
During the trial, the jury heard from experts who believed that Allitt had been suffering with a mental illness throughout her life, which caused her to commit the murders.
Well, Munchausen syndrome is a condition which basically means that people will invent symptoms in themselves in order to gain the attention of medical professionals. There's also Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This is when somebody invents symptoms in somebody else in order to get attention from medical professionals, and that somebody else is often a child or somebody who you're in charge of the care of.
What's her name?
I think she's certainly ill. And
she's a different case entirely.
There has to be an element of evil somewhere within that, because people can be ill without wishing to cause harm to other people.
On the 28th of May 1993, after a draining 3-month trial, the jury had reached a decision.
I think the moment we were called back into the court is something, you know, I'll always remember. It was very tense, you know, very quiet. The member of the jury stood up, and that first verdict came in of guilty. And
thank you, Joshua. Appreciate the likes. Welcome back.
And there was just again, an intake of breath, lasted just a couple of seconds. Then someone, I remember, shouted yes, and I think there was a couple of people clapping, and then tears from the families, tears from members of the public. It was a very difficult job for the police to actually say, you know, without doubt, Beverly Allitt was responsible. So there was always that possibility if the jury could have just tipped the other way. And thankfully, you know, that guilty verdict came in. I think it was a huge sense of relief for everyone.
On May the 28th, 1993, Judge Mr. Justice Latham sentenced Beverly Allitt to 13 concurrent life sentences, one for each of the charges against
May she
her.
never come out.
A relieved David Crampton made a statement outside the courtroom.
Well, I saw Beverly Allitt as a rather pathetic figure, really, and when we listened to her medical evidence, we probably could conclude that these tragedies were inevitable.
There was clearly some massive media interest associated with the Allitt case, both pre and post the trial. That was pretty easy for me and my family because Paul was at home and well. If something worse had happened to Paul, such as it happened to other families, how would I have conducted myself? I don't know. Thankfully, I'll never have to know. Paul is 26 years old, he has a house, he has a long-term partner, lovely girl, he's got a career. Paul's doing very well, very, very well.
Beverly Allitt was immediately sent to Holloway Prison, but after just a week behind bars, she was transferred to Rampton Secure Hospital in Nottinghamshire.
I think the fact that Beverly Allitt has ended up in a secure hospital is a really interesting one for me, because this is somebody who, before developing Munchausen syndrome by proxy, could have been argued to have just Munchausen syndrome. So she was fabricating illnesses and symptoms in herself before she was harming other people. She was going after that role as the patient. She wanted to be seen, you know, by medical professionals and play that sick role. She's essentially achieved what she set out to achieve. She's got that status as the patient, which she always wanted.
What do I think about where Allitt's serving her sentence? I don't waste any energy on that. I don't really think about it. She doesn't enjoy the same freedoms that I do, the rest of my family, and the vast majority of the population of this country. She's in a prison. Whether that is more comfortable than perhaps some people would like is a bit academic, really.
In December 1993, Central Television interviewed Beverly Allitt inside Rampton Hospital as part of a special news report.
She enjoys relative luxury and freedom within the maximum security walls. The parents of her victims, who gave their approval for these pictures to be included in Central TV's The Tuesday Special tonight, believe she should be in prison.
It's not too bad.
What's a good thing about it?
It's crazy.
I've got more freedom in it.
You like it better than where you were before?
Yeah.
Why?
Because I've got more freedom. I'm not locked up all the time.
Stuart Clifton also visited Allitt inside Rampton in 1994, determined to get the truth out of her.
She made admissions at that time. She admitted 9 of the 13 cases that she'd been convicted of. She wouldn't have anything to do with the 2 Phillips cases. The minute that I began to press her for details about precisely what she'd done, what she'd used, she just walked away from me, wouldn't answer any more questions.
There are plenty of questions left unanswered, especially for the loved ones of the victims of Beverly Allitt.
Allitt's crimes are like dropping a pebble into a pool of water. Those ripples spread far and wide. A dramatic effect clearly on the families of the victims, but their extended family, grandparents, parents, etc. And of course a dramatic effect on the hospital and its staff. So her crimes went far and wide into the community, not just the immediate people affected.
I think Beverly Allitt was really most at home when she was in the middle of a drama. So she was deliberately creating the drama and then casting herself in a leading role within it.
There's a real impact there of you know, it could have been a family member, you know, it's the local hospital. One of my members of my younger family could have gone into the hospital to be cared for by a nurse, and look what happened. And that's the thing with this story, you know, it could have happened to absolutely anyone. The parents who were affected by that were purely unlucky that their child went into that hospital on that day and that Beverly Allitt was their nurse.
We may never understand why Beverly Allitt intentionally set out to poison the children she was meant to care for. Her lust for attention turned from selfish to deadly, and for 3 months in 1991, she acted upon it in the most horrific manner. Nobody on Ward 4 was safe. But the determination of doctors and police brought justice for all the victims' families and proved that Beverly Allitt, the angel of death, was a cold-blooded killer.
Crazy.
On November the 11th, 1988, police searching for missing 51-year-old Bert Montoya paid a visit to the boarding house where he'd been living in Sacramento, California. Rumors of suspicious activity in the garden led detectives to begin digging up the area.
I'm sitting in this hole and I'm hanging on to what looks like a human femur bone.
Over the next 3 days, 7 bodies would be discovered under the ground at 1426 F Street. The landlady and number 1 suspect was a 59-year-old woman named Dorothea Puente.
When you look at this person, you don't automatically assume or even think that this is a serial killer. She looks like everybody's grandma.
Puente had been stealing from the tenants who trusted her. The easiest way to keep them quiet was to murder them.
She was a survivalist. Killing these people was necessary to survive, period. They had to go.
Dorothea Puente had been unmasked as one of the world's most evil killers. It is one of the most infamous homes in the USA. 1426 F Street in downtown Sacramento, California, became the makeshift burial site of 7 people. Their landlady and murderer was 59-year-old Dorothea Puente. Eventually charged with 9 murders in 1988, she had poisoned her tenants in order to steal from them. Puente died in 2011 at the age of 82, but the house lives on, now under the ownership of Tom Williams and Barbara Holmes. It's become a macabre monument to her.
It was built in 1895, and it's gone through a lot of iterations. A lot of people have been in and out of it. It can't be torn down. It's considered a historic house in Sacramento, and they would not let anybody tear it down. So here it sits.
Detective John Cabrera helped bring Puente to justice when he uncovered human remains in the yard of 1426 F Street in November 1988.
As far as the interior of this house, it's still the same. The floors in which the victims walked on, the floor in the sleeping bedroom is where the victims lied. It's still the original floors in here. Everything.
The Victorian house has become a tourist attraction, and Tom and Barbara have embraced the gruesome history of it.
We love it. We have no problem whatsoever with any of it. So it's just our house, and we made it a home, and we're pretty happy with it. You still get people walking by asking, you know, how could we be crazy enough to buy this house and stuff. But between the two of us, we've made it into a home.
Yeah, and you know, we tried to make it more comfortable and try to diffuse the whole mystique around it. And yeah, we're doing our best.
She was a hardened criminal in the body of a little old lady. Yeah, she was a hard person.
Pure evil.
Despite the renovations, John still remembers the home as the boarding house where 9 people lost their lives.
This is what I would call the death room. This is where Dorothea would bring her victims after giving them the drug and alcohol combination, and then bringing them in here and leaving them on the floor until she could prepare them at a later time. And when I pulled the carpet back, the odor was so overwhelming, it was unbelievable. But I knew and recognized that smell. And it was the smell of putrefied body fluid that had seeped through the wooden floor from her victims who had laid there for anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, probably.
The day after finding the first body, Saturday, November the 12th, 1988, John vividly recalls the moment he realized the little old lady living at 1426 F Street was not what she seemed.
I looked up at one point onto that balcony, and Dorothea was standing there looking right straight down at me, knowing that probably within minutes I was going to uncover that second body, and sidetracked me from digging in order to walk her over to the motel. And it's there she made her escape.
Puente would remain a wanted fugitive for 5 days, but her story begins over 85 years ago. She was born Dorothea Gray in San Bernardino County, California, on January the 9th, 1929.
She was one of several children. She lost both of her parents quite early on. She spent time in an orphanage. She was kind of passed from pillar to post quite a lot. So she didn't form those stable, secure attachments with her caregivers that many of us do. And I think that went on to shape the person that she became.
Dorothea, you know, lived a very difficult early childhood. She was deprived in substantial ways. She didn't have loving parents. She had to scavenge for food.
By the mid-1960s, Dorothea had been married 3 times and taken on the name of her third husband, Puente. She had already served time in prison for forging checks and had found a new way to earn money.
She starts to get involved in sex work, selling her body to basically put clothes on her back and feed herself. So she is living this quite kind of feral existence. Now, here's an individual for whom violence and abuse was just normal for her. If we look back at her childhood experiences, they're certainly not normal and warm and loving. They are quite brutal and quite cold. So this is the only thing that she knows. It's those basic emotions and those basic instincts.
And then, after becoming a prostitute, she discovered this occupation of being a caregiver, which requires minimal qualifications. And all of a sudden, a world was opened up to her.
In 1981, Puente began renting an apartment at 1426 F Street in downtown Sacramento. She took on the role of caretaker for the other tenants in the Victorian boarding house. Soon after, Puente met 61-year-old Ruth Monroe. Ruth's son, Bill Clausen, remembers his mother fondly.
She was great. I mean, she was my mom. I'm going to say she's great. But she was. She brought up 5 kids after my father passed away, and I thought she did a good job. We met Dorothea through a gentleman that my mom met while she was working, and he kept asking her out, and she finally went out with him, and then they started seeing each other, and he introduced her to Dorothea. During their friendship, Dorothea decided she wanted to open a restaurant, and my mom wasn't working anymore, and my mom had a little bit of money, So she ended up opening the little cafe at the Round Corner Bar.
Ruth ended up marrying Harold, the man who'd introduced her to Puente. But soon he was diagnosed with cancer and living full-time in a hospital. Ruth didn't want to live alone, and Puente had an idea. She could live with her at 1426 F Street. It turned out to be a fatal decision.
We moved her in there on Easter Sunday, 1982, and she died April 26th, 2 weeks later. I saw my mom every day from the time I moved her in there. I stopped by there on my way home from work. And the last 3 days of her life, she seemed like she was getting sick. And when I went there, I'd noticed that she had a drink in her hand, and my mom didn't drink. So I asked her, I said, "What's that?" And she said, it was a drink that Dorothea fixed to calm her nerves. I said, fine, I didn't think anything of it because I knew they were friends, and okay, fine.
But Ruth deteriorated so badly over the next few days that the next time Bill went to visit her, she was almost catatonic.
Mom was laying there. I sat next to her and touched her and told her, I said, "Dorothea's taking care of you, you'll be fine." And she had a tear coming out of her eye, and that was it. She didn't say anything. She just laid there. The next morning, I got a call from my brother telling me that mom was dead. Went over there.
Most people have no clue that in 2024, the best way to make money with Amazon is not with physical products.
She had already been taken away by the coroner's wagon, and Dorothea had said that she committed suicide.
The news stunned Bill.
Totally out of character. She had everything to live for. She had grandchildren. She was happy. What's not easy? Not easy. You still have the pain in your heart.
By August 1982, Dorothea was back in trouble with the authorities. She had been abusing her position as caretaker for her fellow tenants.
Dorothea had pled guilty to fraud. She was forging signature on the back of Social Security checks of her victims and then cashing them. She received a prison sentence and was sent to the women's prison down in Chowchilla. Well, in 1985, she was paroled. And when she paroled, she came back to Sacramento, and she came back to 1426 F Street.
The caretaker was back in business. The next time police arrived on Dorothea Puente's doorstep, they would be armed with shovels, searching for a missing man. And what they would unearth in the yard of 1426 F Street would shock the world. In September 1985, 56-year-old Dorothea Puente was out of prison after serving 3 years for fraud and back living at 1426 F Street, the boarding house where she acted as landlady for her ne'er-do-well tenants. Despite being on parole, Puente continued to exploit the other residents by collecting their social security checks and keeping most of the money for herself.
She knows that vulnerable people aren't really looked after, that people are forgotten about, that people don't care about them, and she goes and she targets them. So she's a predator who's not just picking up on individual vulnerabilities, but she's picking up on social ones as well.
For 3 years, Puente went undetected. Tenants at the Sacramento boarding house came and went until November 1988, when a local social worker, Judy Moise, filed a missing persons report after losing touch with a 51-year-old called Bert Montoya. Bert suffered from mental disabilities and was a diagnosed schizophrenic. His last known address was 1426 F Street.
I got a copy of the report, and what I started doing then was running a background check on the missing person, who was Bert Montoya, and trying to get a little bit of background on him, and also running a check on the caretaker who was in charge of this particular individual. And Bert was a disabled adult. And the caretaker, Dorothea Puente, was apparently in charge of him living here.
On November the 11th, 1988, John Cabrera, his partner Terry Brown, and Puente's parole officer Jim Wilson decided to pay a visit to 1426 F Street to search for some clues into the disappearance of Bert Montoya.
Prior to leaving, on that day, we were starting to leave, and Judy Moise turned to me and said, "You guys better take some shovels." And I went, "Well, what for?" And she said, "Because I've driven by in the past and I've seen mounds of dirt out there. And it kind of looked like a burial ground."
Armed with shovels, John, Terry and Jim arrived at Puente's boarding house.
Well, we come to the front door, knock on the door, the three of us, and she answered. And she's dressed very nicely. She looked at me and said, "I was expecting you guys." You know, it kind of caught me off guard. And I said, "Okay, well," I said, "You know why we're here? We're here to see, about Bert, what happened to him." And she said, "Yeah," and I asked if we could come in.
John's first task was to find out more about the mysterious house.
What is this place, 1426 F Street? What is it here that you're running? What is this place? What are you doing here?
Yeah.
And at that time, she looked at me, she looked at her parole officer, and she just said, "Jim, I'm in violation of my parole."
Puente had been ordered not to run a boarding house after her release from prison in 1985. She'd got away with it for 3 years due to her seemingly charming persona.
Dorothea Puente played this role. She crafted this incredibly skilled performance as a harmless little old lady. So she would often take her teeth out. She would tell people she was 10 or 15 years older than she actually was. She wanted to present herself as innocent and kindly when she was anything but.
While Jim and Terry chatted with Puente in the kitchen, John began his search of 1426 F Street. It appeared that Bert Montoya had simply vanished into thin air.
After I completely looked through the rooms, didn't find anything, I came back. And bearing in mind what Judy had talked about as far as the mounds of dirt, I asked Dorothea, I said, "Look, I'm going to be able to tell the social worker that we looked and we didn't find anything." And she was somewhat agreeable with that. Okay, that's good. And then I said, "I have one more question for you. Can I dig in your yard?" And she says, "Why don't we do this? You guys go back to the office. I know you have a lot better work to do than to be over here, and then I'll make a phone call. I'll call some people, they'll come over here and they'll do the digging for you, and then you can come back." I thanked her, and I said, "We're here, we have the shovels. We'll just go ahead and dig around. If there's anything we put out of place, we'll do our best to get it back, to the way it was." And so she says, "Okay." And that's when we went outside to dig around.
The three men only had 2 shovels, so John borrowed one from Puente.
So we had 3 shovels, 3 of us were digging, and in one of the holes is what we started finding something similar to cloth. And it just seemed out of place in the ground. And then I dig a little bit further, and I was down to about 3 feet. And that's when I thought I struck a tree root. So I took the shovel and I started banging on it, and I started trying to dislodge this root or sever it so I could continue to dig down.
It says root. It says root.
And I couldn't do it. It just wouldn't break. So I got down in the hole, and with both of my hands and bracing my feet, I just kept pulling on this, what I thought to be a root.
Roots.
And I pulled on it and pulled on it, and finally it dislodged itself. And I'm sitting in this hole, and I'm hanging on to what looks like a human femur bone. And at that time, get out of the hole.
Welcome back, Joshua. Thanks for watching the live.
Something's
You're so
up.
supportive. You don't have to
come
do that.
across human remains.
You know what? Thank you so
The
much.
3
You're so
men were
kind.
completely stunned, as was Puente.
She looked down into the hole, and she could see the bone.
That's great.
And she...
You got over on me.
Oh, that's scary.
No one gets over on me. You're gonna rob that place.
grabs your mouth, and she's, oh, is that what I think it is? And, yeah. What can you tell me about this? She says, I don't know. But there's been other people that's been living here. I was in prison, and there was a lot more people living here before her.
John halted the dig. A full forensic search of the yard would have to begin the next day.
At that time, I decided I was going to take Dorothea back down to the Hall of Justice, and I was going to now question her in full. I questioned her about what I found. I questioned her about where Bert was.
I was going to have to go grab some water.
I even
I'll be right
told her
back.
as part of my technique.
Thanks for the
in my
likes again.
interview,
Appreciate
I
it.
said,
Good
I
comment.
bet if I dig any more, I'm going to find more bodies. And she just looked right at me and said, well, if you do, I didn't put them there.
As news spread of the discovery of human remains, the press were in attendance at 1426 F Street the very next day, Saturday, November the 12th, 1988. Deputy Coroner Laura Santos was in charge of the
Be
excavation.
right back.
I think there's a mode you go into when you're an investigator that you just know you have a job to focus on, and you just focus on that. And there were a lot of distractions because there were reporters from all over the world, and there were crowds of people lining the streets, and people would shout at me and tell me things like, turn towards the camera when you're digging. And, you know, I just had to ignore it and shut it all out because I just felt I had a job to do. And I knew it was a really important job, and that a lot of what happened in the future was going to hinge on what I did as far as whether she was prosecuted or not.
Despite having a body unearthed in her yard, 59-year-old Dorothea Puente had not been charged with any offence. There was no reason to suspect she may be responsible. As John Cabrera continued his dig, Puente called him into the house.
And she says, am I under arrest? And I just thought, how odd. What was it that gave her the impression that she was under arrest? Immediately I said, no. And I said, why do you ask? And she said, well, all of this is making me nervous. And she goes, I would like to get a cup of coffee. And I'd like to go over to where my nephew is, around the corner at the hotel. And I said, okay, get what you need and then I'll walk you over there. She comes walking out, has a little red coat, has her purse, walk down the stairs, walk out. But what I had told her was that I would escort her because there were a lot of people starting to gather, and I thought, I don't want anyone walking up to her bothering her, so I used that ruse to walk her down to the corner.
A photographer captured the moment John escorted Puente out of the house. No one yet knew it, but Dorothea Puente would never return to 1426 F Street.
I watched her go all the way down and then go up into the hotel. And that was the last I saw of her at that time. So I run back and I continue digging again. Short time later, I hit something. And I'm fiddling around with my shovel. I'm trying to get it up, figuring what's down here. And I keep trying to bring it up and bring it up. And I do. And in my shovel is a human leg. So immediately I stop, I yell to my commander, we have another one. And he runs over and the first thing he asks is, where's Dorothea?
It was a good question. Where was Dorothea Puente? A second body had been found buried in her yard, and she was nowhere to be seen. She wasn't at the hotel having a coffee. It had all been a ruse so that she could make an escape. Dorothea Puente was on the run. On Saturday, November the 12th, 1988, a police forensic team were digging up the yard of a boarding house in Sacramento, California. They had just unearthed a second body. Dorothea Puente, the 59-year-old landlady of 1426 F Street, had left the house and headed to a nearby hotel to have a coffee. But detectives were now very keen to speak with her.
I said I took her and watched her go to the coffee shop. She's supposedly over there at the hotel. So then another detective came and found out by speaking with the person at the counter in there that in fact Dorothea had come into the hotel, walked through the lobby, went to a payphone, picked up a payphone and apparently called a taxi cab because the cab arrived and took off.
Puente had absconded and detectives had no idea where she was headed.
And so at that time we called in the FBI and enlisted the help of other resources and outside agencies in trying to locate her, because that is what was key right now, is to try to find her as fast as we could.
Back at 1426 F Street, one of the many people who had gathered to watch the dig had given some important information to Deputy Coroner Laura Santos.
He told the story that he had dug holes in this yard for Dorothea and she'd paid him cash, and then she just told him she was burying trash. So he came in and pointed out where he had dug holes.
Over the next 3 days, the excavation of the yard continued.
Just as we kept digging, we kept finding bodies and more bodies. And it just seemed endless. Whatever we took down, whatever we moved, wherever we were digging, we'd find a body. It was just unbelievable. She put 7 people in this small yard, and there wasn't even a witness to any of these burials. Not one.
The 7th and final body was found on Monday the 14th of November. It was buried right in front of the house, just feet from the sidewalk.
Well, she was kind of bundled up in almost like a scrunched up seated position, but she was missing her head, hands, and feet. I went through every flower pot and emptied them out to make sure that we weren't missing anything, but those appendages were never found.
To this day, we've never recovered the head, hands, or feet. Their whereabouts, it's anybody's guess. If the walls in this home could talk, we would probably be horrified.
3 days after the discovery of the 7th body, Thursday the 17th of November, Dorothea Puente was finally found. She had been spotted by a man in a bar almost 400 miles from Sacramento in Los Angeles.
He goes home, and while he's watching TV, he sees her on TV as being wanted on the news. So he calls LAPD.
Prove trust without the fuss with Vanta AI. Complete security questionnaires up to 5 times faster. Vanta AI learns from your documents and past responses to generate instant and accurate answers for you to approve.
Gives the information. I was just having drinks with this person.
The man told the police which hotel Puente was staying in, and she was promptly arrested. John Cabrera immediately flew down to John Wayne Airport in nearby Santa Ana.
We landed, LAPD pulled up, out on the tarmac. We got out of the plane, and there she was. They had her in cuffs. You know, we ceremoniously walked over, and they transferred her to me. I asked her, you know, are you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. And then out of nowhere, she just says, Mr. Cabrera, I'm sorry.
John had many questions to ask about the 7 bodies buried in Puente's yard, but there was still no proof that they had been murdered, and the 59-year-old fugitive wasn't planning on a confession.
We got back here to Sacramento. I took her down to the Hall of Justice. At that time, I asked her if she wanted to give any kind of a statement, and she declined, and so we just booked her into Sacramento County Jail. And that would be the last time that I'd ever speak with her. She would never speak to me again.
With Puente safely locked away, the task of identifying the 7 bodies had begun.
Most of them didn't have teeth, or they had 1 or 2 teeth. In the case of the one body in the front yard, she didn't have any hands, so we couldn't do fingerprints. So we started gathering information.
Most of the tenants at 1426 F Street were either homeless or estranged from their families, which made identifying them even more difficult.
In the beginning, there were people saying, oh, you're never going to be able to do this. And so I was pretty happy that I was able to identify everybody, and they all had some kind of disposition, you know, as far as most of them had some family members somewhere, and so they were all buried.
Among the 7 names was Bert Montoya, the man whose disappearance had initiated the dig on F Street.
Bert would be the 3rd body that I found. He was buried under a concrete basin in the backyard. He was number 3, and that puzzle was now solved.
Bert Montoya had wandered away. He had some type of mental deficiency, and his parents had always taken care of him. And about 13 years before he died, he disappeared from their home in New Orleans, Louisiana, and they had no idea what had happened to him. And it turned out that his 92-year-old mother was still alive, and she had been searching for him her whole life, or ever since he'd been missing. And so they were really, really grateful to know, even though it was such a sad ending, they were very thankful that they were able to have him come home.
As well as identifying the victims, Laura needed to find out the cause of their deaths. Toxicology reports showed that each of the 7 bodies had traces of the same prescription sleeping pill.
We did find traces of Delmane, the drug, in the bodies, and that was another thing that I was able to determine by gathering all these medical records on everyone. None of the victims had ever been prescribed Delmane. Only Dorothea Puente had been prescribed Delmane.
This particular drug, when coupled with alcohol, could be deadly. It just simply puts you in a catatonic state, and with the alcohol, overwhelm the body and stop the heart.
Poisoning is one of the ways we've seen female serial killers operate because it's a way that doesn't require a lot of physical strength. And so you don't have to overcome your victim physically, because that's